April 18th, 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was hiding in his bunker. Entire German divisions were surrendering without a fight. For most American soldiers pushing through the countryside, it felt like the final chapter of a long, brutal nightmare. But on that cold, gray afternoon, just outside a small village in northern Germany, a patrol from the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division saw something that didn't look like surrender. It looked like smoke. Two jeeps rolled slowly down a narrow dirt road lined with skeletal trees. The fields on either side were quiet. Too quiet. No artillery, no gunfire, no civilians. Just wind. And, in the distance, rising above the tree line, a thin column of black smoke twisted into the sky. Probably an ammo dump, one corporal muttered. Well, maybe a retreating German unit had torched supplies before fleeing. That had become common. Burn the records, burn the weapons, leave nothing behind. The lead jeep slowed. Through the trees, the soldiers began to see the shape of it. Not a barn, not a farmhouse, a mansion, 3 stories tall, stone exterior, tall iron gates hanging open, one side of the roof partially collapsed. Flames no longer roaring, but still alive inside, eating what remained. The mansion stood alone on a small rise, overlooking the empty fields like it once belonged to someone important. Very important. The patrol commander raised his hand. Stop. The engines died. For a moment there was only the crackling of distant fire and the sound of boots hitting dirt. Then the wind shifted, and the smell reached them. But it wasn't just burned wood. It wasn't just smoke. There was something else in it. Something sweet. Something heavy. One of the soldiers stopped walking. He had smelled it before, months earlier, when they had liberated a small labor camp near the Rhine. He swallowed hard. No, he whispered under his breath. The men approached cautiously, rifles raised. The iron gates bore a Nazi eagle insignia, blackened but still visible. The driveway was littered with half-burned papers scattered like snow across the gravel. Official documents, stamped with red seals. Most were still smoldering. Someone had tried to destroy something, and had done it in a hurry. They reached the front steps. The massive oak doors were half open, one hanging crooked from a shattered hinge. Inside, a smoke drifted lazily through the grand entrance hall. The walls were decorated with enormous oil portraits. Some had fallen and cracked. Others were slashed, as if someone had taken a knife to them before fleeing. A chandelier lay smashed on the marble floor. Boots crunched over broken glass as the Americans stepped inside. The mansion was silent. Too silent. No bodies in the main hall, no guards, no movement. Only the distant crackle of fire somewhere deeper inside. The corporal motioned left. 2 men cleared the dining room. Empty, silverware scattered. A long wooden table set for no one. Half-burned maps still pinned to the walls. Another team checked the study. File cabinets pulled open, drawers dumped, ash drifting from a smoldering fireplace stuffed with documents. Oh, whoever had been here hadn't expected much time. They were destroying evidence. But evidence of what? Then one private called out from the far end of the hall, "Sir, you need to see this." The patrol moved toward a wide staircase leading down. The basement door stood ajar. Unlike the rest of the house, the fire hadn't fully reached below, but smoke had. Thick, black, heavy. The smell was stronger here. That same sweet, sickening odor. The corporal hesitated only for a second before nodding. 2 soldiers wrapped cloth around their mouths. They descended. Each step creaked. Halfway down, one of them nearly slipped. The floor was damp. Not water, something darker. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of a flashlight cut through the haze. The basement was large, almost like a storage facility. Wooden crates stacked along the walls, metal shelves filled with boxes. Several had burst open, gold watches spilled across the floor. Necklaces tangled together, wedding rings, silver candlesticks, engraved with unfamiliar names. Suitcases, dozens of them. each labeled carefully in white paint. Jewish names, cities from across Europe, Paris, Warsaw, Prague, Amsterdam. One soldier bent down and opened a suitcase. Inside were children's clothes, tiny shoes, a doll with one eye missing. He slowly closed it again. The corporal's breathing grew heavier. This wasn't a home. This wasn't random looting. This was organized, systematic, industrial. Then the flashlight moved further into the basement, us toward a heavy iron door at the far end of the room. It was blackened, the handle warped by heat, but the door itself remained closed, locked from the outside. The smell was strongest there. One private stepped closer. He touched the metal, still warm. The corporal felt something in his chest tighten. He didn't want to open it, but he knew they had to. He gestured for a crowbar. The metal screamed as they forced it between the door and the frame. One pull, two. The lock snapped. The door creaked inward. Smoke rolled out like a living thing. And for a moment, no one moved. Because inside that room, they weren't looking at treasure. They weren't looking at stolen property. They were looking at something far worse. And in that instant, every man in that basement understood, this mansion had not just stored the spoils of war. It had hidden its victims, and whatever had happened in that locked room had been meant to disappear in the flames. The smoke poured past them as the iron door swung wider. At first, they could see nothing, just darkness. Then the beam of a flashlight cut through the haze, and it stopped. One of the soldiers inhaled sharply. The room wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across. Stone walls, no windows, no ventilation except for a narrow shaft near the ceiling, blackened by soot. The floor was covered in ash, not scattered, layered, as if something, or many things, had burned here for hours. Against the far wall, shapes began to emerge through the smoke. Human shapes. One soldier stepped forward, then froze. There were bodies, not stacked, not arranged, collapsed where they had fallen, some slumped against the wall, some near the door, some curled on the floor as if trying to shield themselves from heat that had nowhere to escape. The corporal felt his throat close. The fire upstairs had been meant to destroy documents, but down here, this had been intentional. The walls bore scratch marks, deep gouges in the stone, fingernail streaks. Near the door, the metal was bent outward, as if someone inside had tried desperately to force it open. One private dropped his flashlight. It clattered across the floor, its beam spinning wildly across charred faces, burned hands, hollow eye sockets frozen in silent screams. No one spoke. They had seen death before. They had fought through Normandy, through the Hurtgen forest, through towns reduced to rubble. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a room, a locked room. The corporal stepped carefully across the ash and knelt beside one of the bodies. The remains were badly burned, but something caught his attention. A metal tag, still hanging around the neck, stamped with a number, not a name. A number. He looked around. Several of the others wore the same. Prisoner tags. These weren't German soldiers. They weren't civilians caught in crossfire. They were detainees, workers, prisoners. Someone had locked them in here and then set the house on fire. A soldier near the shelves called out again. "Oh, sir, there's more." In the corner of the room were ledgers. Thick accounting books stacked neatly inside a metal crate, untouched by flame. The corporal flipped one open. Inside were columns. Dates, train numbers, quantities, but not of supplies, of people. Each page listed transports arriving at nearby rail depots. Next to each entry was a notation. Processed. Transferred. Special relocation. Beside many names was a small red mark, a check, as if confirming delivery of cargo. Except the cargo had been human. The ledger continued for months, maybe years. The mansion wasn't just a residence. It was an administrative hub, a collection point, confiscated property from deported families stored below, human beings processed through its basement. And when the war began collapsing around them, the final order had likely come down. Destroy the records, eliminate witnesses, burn everything. But they hadn't finished. They ran out of time. Outside, an engine roared. More jeeps were arriving. The rest of the company had followed the smoke. Within minutes, dozens of American soldiers filled the entrance hall. Some secured the perimeter. Others entered the basement. When word spread of what was below, the mood shifted. Hardened infantrymen stood silent along the basement walls, staring. One sergeant removed his helmet. Another crossed himself. The battalion commander arrived shortly after. Colonel James Whitaker, 43 years old, veteran of North Africa and Italy. A man not easily shaken. He descended the stairs slowly. The smell hit him halfway down. He paused, then continued. When he reached the chamber, he said nothing for nearly a full minute. He surveyed the bodies, the scratch marks, the ledgers, the locked door. Then he turned to his adjutant. "Get division command on the radio." His voice was steady but cold. "Seal this place. No one touches anything. I want photographers. I want medical officers. I want every document preserved." He stepped back toward the door and looked once more at the room. "This wasn't panic," he muttered. "This was policy." Outside, word began spreading through nearby units. Another atrocity, another hidden site. But this one was different. This wasn't a camp discovered by advancing forces. This was a private mansion, owned by someone powerful enough to live in luxury while overseeing death below his own floorboards. The soldiers began searching the rest of the estate more thoroughly. In a second-floor bedroom, they found framed photographs. The mansion's owner stood proudly beside senior SS officers. Another photo showed him shaking hands with a high-ranking official in Berlin. In one image, he stood in front of this very house, smiling. The back of the frame bore a name, SS Standartenführer Karl Brenner, Regional Transport and Resettlement Authority. The title sounded bureaucratic, harmless, but the basement told the truth. Brenner had not been a soldier. He had been an organizer, a coordinator, a man who moved people like inventory. And when the front lines moved too close, he had tried to erase the evidence. But one question remained. Where was he now? A search of the grounds revealed a staff car missing from the garage. Fresh tire tracks led toward the main road. He had fled, probably days earlier. The fire had likely been lit just before retreat, a final act of concealment or cruelty. As evening fell, the smoke thinned. American guards stood watch around the mansion. Inside, medical personnel carefully examined the remains. Preliminary estimates counted over 60 bodies in the chamber. Men, women, perhaps even older children. Exact numbers would come later. But the truth was already clear. This house had operated quietly for years. Its neighbors likely knew the staff, the deliveries, the guarded trucks arriving at night, and yet no one had stopped it. As darkness settled over the countryside, Colonel Whitaker stood outside the mansion and looked toward the nearby village, lights glowing peacefully in windows. Somewhere out there were people who had seen the smoke earlier that day, who had watched this house burn, and had said nothing. Whitaker exhaled slowly. "If we want to understand what happened here," he said quietly to his adjutant, "we need to find out what this man was doing before he ran." He looked back at the mansion one more time. The flames had nearly died, but the truth was only beginning to surface, and whatever story this place was hiding, it didn't start in the fire. It started long before. And to uncover it, they would have to go back. I had to understand what happened inside that locked basement chamber. You have to go back nearly 2 years, long before the smoke, before the retreat, before the fire, meant to erase everything. Back to 1943, back to when the mansion was still pristine, its gardens trimmed perfectly, its windows polished, its owner hosting elegant dinners under crystal chandeliers. SS Standartenführer Karl Brenner had arrived in the region with authority and confidence. Officially, he was a regional transport and resettlement administrator. The title sounded harmless, administrative, bureaucratic, but his job was simple. He organized deportations. Trains arrived filled with Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and forced laborers from across occupied Europe. Before those trains continued east toward camps like Auschwitz or Dora Mittelbau, they stopped. And when they stopped, the prisoners were processed. Not at a camp, at the mansion. Survivor testimonies would later reveal how it worked. Prisoners were unloaded at a small rail junction 5 miles away. The strongest were selected for temporary labor details. They were transported by truck to Brenner's estate, down into the basement. There, under armed supervision, they sorted the confiscated property taken from deported families. Gold rings, wedding bands, watches, family heirlooms, religious artifacts, cash. Everything cataloged, everything recorded in those same ledgers now sitting in American hands. The mansion was not a prison camp. It was something colder, a clearinghouse. A place where human lives were reduced to inventory numbers. The prisoners worked long shifts in the basement, breathing dust and mold, surrounded by the stolen memories of strangers who had already disappeared. They slept in a smaller adjacent chamber, barred, damp, windowless. They were fed barely enough to stand. And every few weeks, when new transports arrived and fresh labor was needed, the old group would vanish. Officially, they were relocated. In reality, they were sent east, or shot along the way. By early April 1945, the war was collapsing around Germany. American forces were crossing the Rhine. British troops were advancing from the north. Soviet armies were pushing from the east. The illusion of control was crumbling. On April 15th, Brenner received new orders. Destroy sensitive records. Evacuate remaining detainees. Leave nothing for the Allies. But there was a problem. The rail lines were chaotic. Fuel was scarce. Roads were clogged with retreating units and refugees. Brenner had fewer than 30 guards remaining at the estate, and in the basement, 63 prisoners were still alive. Weak. Exhausted. Witnesses. If American troops reached the mansion and found them, the records would not matter. The testimonies would speak for themselves. According to a later interrogation of a captured guard, Brenner held a brief meeting in his study that evening. He was calm, cold. He reportedly said only one thing: they cannot be left behind. That night, all the guards herded the prisoners into the storage chamber, the same chamber now filled with ash. The prisoners likely believed they were being moved, perhaps transferred, perhaps evacuated. Instead, they were pushed inside. The iron door slammed shut, locked from the outside. At first, there was confusion, then pounding, shouting, please. The guards dragged crates of documents into the main hall upstairs. They doused them with fuel. They poured gasoline along the floors. The fire was meant to consume everything, but fire does not move downward easily in a stone mansion. Smoke does. The guards reportedly hesitated. One younger soldier questioned the order. Brenner answered him with a stare. "You want them to testify?" Moments later, flames climbed the stairwell, and thick smoke rolled into the basement. Inside the locked chamber, panic turned to terror. The prisoners would have felt it first in their lungs, the air thinning, the smoke creeping low along the floor. Some tried to force the door. The scratch marks on the walls proved it. Some likely tried to climb toward the ventilation shaft, too narrow to escape. As oxygen disappeared, desperation took over. When the smoke became unbearable, some collapsed quickly. Others fought longer. The gouges in the stone told that story. The guards did not stay to watch. As flames engulfed the upper floors, they fled. By dawn, the mansion was burning. By mid-morning, Brenner and his remaining staff were gone. They abandoned the estate to smoke and silence. But they underestimated two things: how fast the Americans were moving, and how much the fire would fail to destroy. 2 days later, U.S. patrols followed the smoke, and the locked door in the basement still held its secret. Back in the present, April 18, 1945, Colonel Whitaker stood in the ruined study reading the final entries in Brenner's ledger. The last page was dated April 16th. 63 names, marked with a red slash. No relocation note, no transport number, just a single word written in German. Erledigt. Completed. Whitaker closed the book slowly. Downstairs, medics had discovered something else. One of the bodies near the chamber door had been positioned differently from the others, shielding someone. Beneath him, barely alive, they found a survivor, a man in his early 30s, burned. Smoke-damaged lungs, barely conscious. He had survived by pressing his face near a crack in the stone foundation, where a thin line of air entered. When he regained enough strength to speak, he gave them only fragments. They locked us. No air. Fire above. He confirmed what the walls already revealed. It was deliberate. Not chaos. Not accident. Not crossfire. Murder. The war was ending, but for the men and women inside that chamber, it had ended in darkness and smoke. Colonel Whitaker looked once more at the nearby village through the cracked study window. The church steeple stood untouched, homes intact. Civilians had watched this mansion operate for years. Trucks arriving, guards posted, smoke rising now from its roof, and still no one had intervened. Whitaker felt something colder than anger settle in his chest. The fire had been meant to destroy evidence. Instead, it had exposed something worse, complicity. And as night approached once again over the German countryside, the question was no longer only about what Brenner had done. It was about who had allowed him to do it, and whether anyone would answer for it. By the morning of April 19th, 1945, word of the burned mansion had spread through the division. Photographers arrived first, then intelligence officers, then a convoy of military police. The basement chamber was documented carefully, every scratch mark, every body, every ledger page, photographed and cataloged. The American command had learned something over the past months. If you did not document evil, someone would later deny it. Colonel Whitaker stood outside the estate gates as trucks rolled toward the nearby village. He had made a decision. The townspeople would see what had happened. By noon, German civilians were being assembled in the square. Shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, elderly men in worn coats. Some claimed they knew nothing about the mansion's purpose. Some said it was simply an administrative residence. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Whitaker did not argue. He ordered them marched to the estate. They walked in silence past the blackened gates, past the scattered documents still drifting across the gravel. When they entered the basement, the smell was still heavy in the air. Several civilians recoiled instantly. One woman covered her mouth and began to cry. An elderly man muttered, "We did not know." An American sergeant snapped back quietly, "You knew enough." The townspeople were ordered to help remove the bodies. No mass burial. Individual graves. Each victim laid separately in the field beside the mansion. Wooden crosses were constructed from debris gathered on site. Names were taken from the ledger when possible. For those without names, only numbers remained. The civilians worked under armed supervision, not beaten, not abused, but watched closely. The process took 2 full days. Men who had once walked freely past the estate gates now carried the brittle remains of those who had suffocated below it. Some wept openly. Some worked in cold silence. Whitaker made no speeches during the burial. He saved that for the end. When the final grave was filled and the last cross planted in a straight line across the green field, he gathered the townspeople together. Behind him, the burned mansion still stood, hollow windows staring like empty eyes. "You say you did not know," Whitaker began calmly. "Maybe some of you did not." He gestured toward the graves. "But 63 people were brought here. Guards stood watch. Trucks came and went. Smoke rose yesterday morning, and still none of you came to see why." No one answered. "You may not have lit the fire," he continued, "but you lived beside it." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. This is not only about the man who gave the order. It is about what happens when people decide that what they see is not their responsibility. He ordered a sign erected at the entrance to the estate grounds. It would remain there under town supervision. The inscription was simple: "Here lie 63 victims murdered in this house. They were buried by the citizens of this town. May this place never be forgotten." The townspeople were required to maintain the graves. The estate was seized by Allied authorities, and a formal investigation into Karl Brenner began immediately. But Brenner had planned his escape carefully. 2 days before the Americans arrived, he had changed into civilian clothing. He left behind his uniform, his insignia, even his photographs, carrying forged identity papers and blending into the flood of refugees fleeing westward, and he disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing nation. Post-war intelligence would trace him briefly to Hamburg under a different name, then to a small town in Bavaria. But records became uncertain, witnesses unreliable, files misplaced during early Cold War tensions. Years passed. Trials were held in Nuremberg. Major figures were prosecuted, but mid-level administrators, men like Brenner, sometimes slipped through the cracks. By the 1960s, the trail had grown cold. Some reports suggested he had emigrated. Others claimed he died quietly under an assumed identity. No definitive capture was ever confirmed. The man who had locked 63 people in a basement and set a mansion ablaze never stood in a courtroom. The only justice delivered had fallen on those who remained behind. The civilians had buried the victims. The soldiers had documented the crime. The graves remained. Long after the war ended, the estate grounds were converted into a memorial site. The mansion itself was eventually demolished, but the crosses stayed. Rows of white markers aligned against the green field, maintained each year by local authorities. School children were brought to visit. History lessons were held there. Names read aloud. Because Colonel Whitaker understood something important that day. Punishment fades. Executions end. But memory lasts longer than anger. The American soldiers who first entered that basement carried the smell with them long after they left Germany. Many rarely spoke about it, but in letters home. But some described the moment they realized that evil did not always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it looked like a quiet house on a hill, with polished floors and locked doors. The war in Europe officially ended 3 weeks later. Victory celebrations erupted across the Allied world. But in a field beside a burned mansion in northern Germany, 63 graves stood in silence. The villain had vanished. The victims had names. And the lesson remained. Sometimes the most dangerous crimes are not committed in secret forests or distant camps. They happen in plain sight, behind ordinary walls, watched by ordinary people, and protected by ordinary silence. So here is the question that remains. If you had lived in that village, would you have asked questions? Or would you have closed your shutters and told yourself it wasn't your concern? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear another untold story from the final days of World War II, one that changed the course of thousands of lives, make sure you watch the next video. Thank you for watching.